is a painting that captures the moment when Tipu Sultan, the king of Mysore, was killed. Painted by a British artist, Henry Singleton, in 1802, a few years after Tipu was killed in the Fourth Mysore War, this painting forms the centerpiece of an exhibition organized by the Delhi Art Gallery or DAG in the capital. The exhibition looks at how Tipu was perceived in England and how painters there seemed obsessed about this tiger of Mysore who partnered with the French to pose a serious threat to the British in the 18th century. Art historian Giles Tillotson, who curated this exhibition and also edited the book Tipu Sultan, Image and Distance, gives us a sense of Tipu's world based on these works.
The exhibition came about really around one painting in particular. A few years ago, DAG acquired this magnificent oil painting by Henry Singleton entitled The Last Effort and Fall of Tipu Sultan, supposedly showing the last seconds of his life as he is brought down by British forces during the Siege of Srirangapatna in 1799. It's a very important painting for a number of reasons. It's one of the most impressive of history paintings produced by British artists relating to India, and the great majority of the other history paintings, let's say paintings depicting historical events, are in Britain and they're in public collections. This one has always been in private hands. It's changed hands a number of times in the course of its 200 years of its existence. But when it came up for auction recently, it was acquired by DAG and brought to India. So it's very exceptional as a major British history painting relating to India actually physically present in India and now registered as an antiquity. So it's here forever now. And the idea was then to try to build an exhibition around this painting because there were many other views produced of incidents in the four Mysore Wars. And over a period of time, we assembled a collection of prints and other paintings and related objects, even including newspapers, to put together this assortment of objects which tell the story, really, of how Britain saw the four Mysore Wars. I think the works of art in the exhibition fall into two large groups. There are the history paintings, and then there are landscape views, depictions of various places in Mysore. And they're very different as depictions of Tipu's world. I think the key fact that one has to grapple with in looking at them is that the major history painters represented here, that's Henry Singleton, Robert Carr Porter, and Mather Brown, never came to India. And so their attempts to depict the great events of the four Mysore Wars are largely imaginary. Their perception of Tipu's world is largely imaginary. So, for example, Mather Brown does this wonderful, rather emotional scene of the two sons who were taken as hostages in 1792, saying farewell to their mothers in the Zanana. There's no historical record of such an event actually occurring. Mather Brown has simply reasonably made the assumption that they would have said goodbye to their mothers and then has depicted them doing so. But his imagined construction of that event, of the women themselves, of the space of the Zanana in which it's happening, it's entirely his own fancy. It's not based on first-hand knowledge of the scenes at all. And similar things could be said about the works by Henry Singleton and Robert Carr Porter. Some showing events that we know a lot about, like the storming of Srirangapatna in 1799, others showing events that were merely reported and not directly observed, like indeed the same two boys saying goodbye to their father. On the other hand, the landscapes were produced by artists who were present here. So you get a very different perspective from them. One of them, Robert Hume, was a professional painter, in fact, really a portrait painter, though he produced a series of views of Mysore, of landscape views. Robert Colebrook was not a professional painter, but he was a surveyor, and so became a very skilled landscape artist. James Hunter was in fact an artillery officer who took part in the Third Mysore War, and he produced a series of 40 scenic views of Mysore. So these three were actually on the spot, and they show us, for example, many of the minor hill forts that were involved in actions in particularly the Third Mysore War. And so there you are getting a very direct view of the Mysore of Tipu's time. But the curious thing about the landscapes is that although many of them do have soldiers in them, and you see they are indeed scenes of battle, they're not actually trying to depict the battles taking place. So it's the world of Tipu, as it were, after the storm has passed. It's shown the countryside in a settled and peaceful state. The British view of Tipu Sultan, and indeed of his father, Hyder Ali, develops over a period of time. Remember that the four wars cover over 3 decades, from the 1760s through to 1799. It's really after the second of the wars, which goes so disastrously badly for the British, with the Battle of Pollilur, where the British forces are surrounded and the leading generals, Baird and Bailey, are taken captive. That it's from that point on that Tipu in particular comes to be demonized by the British. His father Hyder Ali dies towards the end of that Third War, and Tipu takes over. And it's partly because of that disaster for the British, and partly because by then Tipu is in league with the French, that he comes to be so demonized. I think that the alliance with the French is very important from the British perspective, because it shows Tipu Sultan daring to think outside of a subcontinental arena. He's relying on the French partly for military technology, but he's also invoking them as ideological allies. And of course, particularly after the French Revolution, the French had been opponents of the British in European wars, well, from the middle of the 18th century. But after the Revolution in particular, they're seen as this rather scary, terrifying, hated ideology. And to think of Tipu Sultan as South Indian ruler in alliance with that makes him even more of a threat. And so part of what the company is doing is it needs to persuade a British audience to get behind their anxiety, to see Tipu Sultan as a serious menace to British interests in India in general, leading to his eventual eradication in 1799. So the key paintings of the exhibition, there's a number that relate to the final siege of 1799. So we have as the centerpiece of the exhibition the oil painting by Henry Singleton depicting the last effort and fall of Tipu Sultan, and also prints that derive from that. So Singleton is seizing the opportunity of this important event to establish his reputation, his fame in London by painting a dramatic visualization of this scene and exhibiting it. But he's also keen that the image is printed, and so it circulates much more widely. And some of the other works we have are in printed form. Robert Carr Porter, for example, produced this enormous painting. It no longer exists, but he produced his representation of the storming of the fort in May 1799 on a canvas that was 120 feet long. And it gives you kind of a sense, an idea of the hype, the pure drama, the theatre of this whole event, that indeed he literally hired a theatre, the Lyceum in London, in order to exhibit this enormous work and charge people to go in. And it was displayed on a kind of curved screen so that the audience could literally immerse themselves in this extraordinary event. But not content with that very dramatic exhibition, he also had it printed, engraved, and distributed in that form. And it's one of those that the print alone is 9 feet wide, and we have one of those. Other scenes go back to an earlier phase, to the conclusion of the Third Mysore War, which pitted Cornwallis against Tipu Sultan. Cornwallis successfully captured Bangalore. He then moved on, and on his second attempt to besiege Srirangapatna, he doesn't actually storm the fort, but he forces a surrender, and a very unequal treaty is imposed on Tipu Sultan. And it's part of the terms of that treaty that two of his sons are made to surrender as hostages. And that is picked up by artists because it seems a moment that's charged with emotion. And I have to say, so one of the important things to understand about these pictures is, yes, some of the very dramatic ones, like Robert Carr Porter's, do focus on the military action. But these paintings are really coming out of an artistic tradition which is common to both British and French painting at the end of the 18th century, which focuses on moments that are of great moral importance. And so I think that what captures the imagination is not so much Cornwallis's siege of Srirangapatna, which is not shown, but the aftermath, the surrender of the sons saying goodbye to their father, the sons saying goodbye to their mothers, the sons delivering the treaty to Lord Cornwallis, the signed version of the treaty, because it's seen here that we can focus the audience's attention on moments of moral value. Cornwallis is depicted almost as a sort of paternalistic figure looking after these boys, where in fact you might read the surrender of two underage boys as hostages in quite different ways. The intention is to look at the British particularly, even more than the Indian opponents, as people with great moral fibre, with great moral virtues, and those are the real subjects of the paintings. The depiction of the people, the Indian people, is very interesting. We have a number of portraits. Portraits of Tipu himself are quite generic. They're all very similar, and I think they're probably all based on one or two sources, one or two court paintings that were made in Srirangapatna during his lifetime. We know that Lord Cornwallis owned such a painting, and he showed it to a London-based publisher, Edward Orme, who had it copied and engraved, and we have a copy of that print, and that's very much the set image of Tipu Sultan. We have an Indian painting that's from slightly later, showing that Tipu was still very much present in the Indian imagination, still important to people in South India in the middle of the 19th century. But even that, though it's in mirror image, is closely based on the same sort of style, the same profile style of portrait. We have a very small miniature of Tipu's father, Hyder Ali. So the men are represented. The women, as they're shown in the British pictures, are entirely imagined. Of course, that's to be expected in the sense that the artist didn't have access to the Zanana, even those who came. But one person did, and I think it's an important contribution of this exhibition or the larger project, including the book. There's a chapter by Jennifer Howes where she uses a document that was drawn up by a young British officer after the conclusion of the siege in 1799, where he goes into the Zanana to document, to list the women who are going to be taken captive. The women of Tipu's court remained effectively under house arrest in the Fort of Vellore for the remainder of their natural lives. But obviously the British wanted to know who it was that they were arresting. They were also given pensions to cover their personal expenses in proportion to their status. So the British at the time needed to know, who was a begum and of which ruler, who was a dowager begum of Hyder Ali's, who was one of the queens of Tipu, who were their servants, what is the distinction between someone who might have worked as a milkmaid, someone who was a senior servant, someone who was a dancer or other kind of performer, or somebody serving the performers and so on. So you've got a whole hierarchy listing over 600 women. And they're all named in this document. So suddenly, instead of just having the names of the men, including the boys who were arrested, you have a document which tells you the names of the women, including the mothers of those boys. And this document had gone unlooked at for 200 years, and the women's side of the story had not been told until now.
While these paintings depict how the British saw Tipu Sultan, you get another perspective of the period from the frescoes at the Darya Daulat Palace in Srirangapatna. Interestingly, we also have works that depict what Tipu would have actually looked like.
When looking at English works of art that depict India, it's a point I often make that it's essential, if you can, to try and contrast it with images that are made by Indian artists of the same time, looking at either the same subjects or perhaps selecting different subjects. The point being that if you want to, as it were, unpack a work of art ideologically, and these are very much ideological works of art, they're propagandist works of art, in order to understand them, you have to have something to compare them with. How might an Indian artist have seen or depicted similar events? Well, it's peculiarly difficult in this case because there aren't similar works of art of the same sort of scale coming out of the Mysore court. The major works that show the Mysore court's view of the Mysore Wars are mural paintings painted on the walls of the Darya Daulat Palace in Srirangapatna. So they're there, they're in situ, they're fixed. So yes, in the book we have a chapter about those, written by Savita Kumari. And of course, you do get a very different perspective. Not surprisingly, the emphasis is very much more on the second Mysore War, in which the Mysore powers were so much more successful. You have a huge depiction of the Battle of Polilore, not a subject that is of the same interest to the British artists. Indeed, from the British perspective, we have only one small diagram done by a military officer showing the positions of the various forces of the Battle of Polilore, but it's not deemed a fit subject for British history painting because the British lost it. So that comparison can be made, as it were, on the pages of the book, but not on the walls of the gallery. What we've done here is to bring in other works by other Indian artists to show Indian life, so that there's a delightful collection of pages from a company album, a trades album from Tanjore, from about this period, which shows South Indian people going about their trades and normal work, to show you what life was like in South India in the period. The French, of course, had a very different perception of Tipu. They saw him as a likely ally who would help them in their struggles against the British in an attempt to gain supremacy, particularly in southern India. We don't have a French artistic representations of him, sadly. The French appear on the walls in the gallery in other ways. I mean, for example, there's a plan of Fort St. George in Madras, Chennai as it now is, done by a French cartographer, a reminder that there was a period when actually the French succeeded in capturing Madras, just as indeed the British at times captured both Chandanagar and Pondicherry. But these occupations were usually brief. They were usually returned to the originating power, usually as a result of some treaty drawn up in Europe rather than further action on the ground. So yes, the French are very much a part of the story. And as I say, they're part of, from the British perspective, a part of why Tipu is to be so dreaded. From the French perspective, as I say, it's part of an ongoing rivalry against the British in South India, which of course eventually they lose. A number of portraits of Tipu survive. They're fairly generic in nature. They always show him in profile, turbaned, in splendid robes, very much in the sort of Jaroka style of portraiture. There's a famous one in the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is believed to be contemporary with him. The image printed by Orme is based on that or something very similar. So the fact that there's a family resemblance, as it were, between the known portraits of Tipu suggests that they're reasonably authentic as depictions of him. The one other object in the exhibition which you mustn't miss, and I think is a lovely and wonderful piece, is the wooden sculpture of a tiger, which I've described as being the great nephew of the famous automaton in the V&A. If viewers are familiar with that very famous object that came out of Srirangapatna in 1799, was sent back to London. It belonged for a long while to the East India Company, was exhibited in their library in London, but then transferred to the South Kensington Museum by the middle of the 19th century, and it's still very much there. It's this enormous sculpture which shows a tiger devouring an Englishman, and it has workable parts. It has a sort of internal organ and moving parts, so that when wound up, the tiger roars and the Englishman screams. Ours is not an automaton, it's simply a painted wooden sculpture, but very much obviously a relative, a descendant of that piece. The way in which it's painted shows that it's come out of the same region at roughly the same sort of period. It's smaller, but it's a sort of delightful younger sibling of the famous automaton. And it's nice also, of course, to have an Indian-made object, an object from the court of Mysore in the exhibition. We're not in this exhibition trying to make an evaluation of Tipu, and in a sense it's a perspective that's deliberately taken out of context. These are mostly works of art made by British artists for a British audience 220 years ago. And really, I've described some of them as propagandist. I mean, they're feeding into a British hysteria, really, around Tipu Sultan. And I thought, because such an important painting had been acquired and had been brought to India, it would be interesting to show it to a modern Indian audience.